So, what if I told you that most of the innovation problems you're struggling with aren't actually innovation problems at all? Welcome to day one of TRIZ for Innovators. We're going to start with a deliberately uncomfortable idea. Before you learn any powerful problem-solving tools, you first have to learn when not to use them.
You know that feeling, right? That constant, relentless pressure to innovate? But what if all that energy is pushing you in the completely wrong direction? It's a really common trap. You pour time, money, and your team's best brainpower into what you think is a breakthrough, but all you get are tiny, incremental gains and a whole lot of frustration.
So let's put a name on this. Let's call it the innovation trap. We're going to break down why so many of these big, ambitious projects feel like you're just running on a treadmill. I mean, you're putting in a ton of effort, but you never really seem to get anywhere new.
This right here is the classic sign of what we call a stalled system. It's that point where every single improvement you try to make in one area just seems to create a new problem somewhere else. It's this endless cycle of trade-offs and compromises. Does that sound at all familiar?
And this brings us to the most important skill we're going to cover today. Seriously, this is it. Learning to tell the difference between a problem that needs a genuine invention versus one that just needs better execution. If you can master this one distinction, it changes absolutely everything. So, to make this crystal clear, we need to start sorting our challenges into two very different buckets. We've got execution gaps on one side and invention gaps on the other.
This is the fundamental split. An execution gap means we already know how to solve it. The solution exists. It's just a matter of good project management, optimization, getting it done. But an invention gap, well, that's totally different. It's blocked by a deep, fundamental conflict, what we call a contradiction. And you can't solve that with just more effort or more budget. It needs a whole new way of thinking.
And this is exactly why we're starting here. Look, TRIZ is an incredibly powerful tool for solving those true invention gaps. And because it's powerful, it's also expensive in time and mental energy. If you try to use it on a simple execution problem, it's like using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. It's not just overkill, it actually creates this false confidence that you're innovating when really you just needed to execute better.
So, the big question is, how can you be sure you're facing a real invention gap? The answer is a simple diagnostic we call the contradiction test. Think of this as the gatekeeper for TRIZ. Here's the key idea. Real innovation doesn't just happen. It begins right at the point of conflict. It's that moment when you try to improve something you want, like making a product faster or stronger, but in doing so, you accidentally make another important thing worse.
And you can check for this tension with a really simple statement, the if, then, but framework. If I do this action, then this good thing happens, but this other bad thing also happens. If your problem doesn't have a but, you are not facing a contradiction. You're in execution land, not TRIZ territory. Simple as that.
You can think of this whole process like a prism. You take a messy, complicated, stalled-out problem, and you pass it through this contradiction analysis. What comes out the other side isn't the final answer. It's something way more valuable. A clean, perfectly defined contradiction that points you directly toward a real breakthrough.
I know this might still feel a little bit abstract, so let's ground it. Let's look at a couple of real-world examples to see exactly how these contradictions show up in practice.
Okay, here's a classic one that car companies have battled for decades. You want to improve strength to make the car safer? Great. But when you do that by adding more steel, the car gets heavier, which tanks your fuel efficiency. A traditional engineer looks for a compromise, a trade-off. A TRIZ thinker wants to kill the contradiction entirely. How can we make it stronger without making it heavier? See the difference?
All right, let's look at a more complex example with a slightly different type of contradiction. Imagine you're building a massive offshore structure, like an oil rig. You need to anchor these huge support piles deep into the seabed. Now, this is what we call a physical contradiction. A single object needs to have two opposite properties at the same time. The tip of the pile has to be sharp, so it can cut through the seabed easily. But it also has to be blunt to create a wide, stable foundation that won't fail. Sharp and blunt? How on earth do you solve that? The solution is just, well, it's beautiful. Instead of trying to find a compromise, like a semi-sharp tip, you separate the two needs in time. First, the pile is sharp during the driving process. Then, once it's in place, a small charge blows the tip apart. You pump concrete into the new cavity, and you've created a wide, blunt, incredibly stable base after it's in position. The contradiction is totally gone.
Okay, now that you've seen how identifying the right contradiction is the key that unlocks the problem, it's time to turn this lens on your own work.
We're going to give you a practical tool you can apply to a challenge you're facing, like right now.
So for this next part, you have a choice. You can either pick a real problem from your job, something that's been bugging you, or you can follow along with our case study, which is the construction of the Hoover Dam. The big contradiction they faced was that the giant drilling platforms had to be there for the workers to drill, but they had to be gone for the dynamite blasting so they wouldn't get blown to bits.
I want you to take a moment, you can even pause here, and walk through these 4 steps for your problem. Be brutally honest, especially with step 3. When you push for that improvement, does something else genuinely get worse? Your goal here is to come out with one clear label: optimization or contradiction.
This is your big takeaway for day 1. By the end of this little exercise, you should have a clear go or no-go decision for using TRIZ, plus that if-then-but sentence. For a lot of people, this is a huge aha moment, realizing that problems you've been banging your head against as innovation challenges are really just execution gaps in disguise. That insight alone can save you so much time and energy.
And that brings us to the end of day 1. Just remember, the first skill of a real innovator isn't just solving problems, it's about finding the right problems to solve. So start looking for those trade-offs, those compromises that everyone else just accepts as the way things are. Because that's where the real breakthroughs are hiding. Tomorrow, we're going to take those contradictions you've just found and start to really pull them apart. See you then.